And now we wait.
Great. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first time we're hosting the NASA Space Up Challenge in Oshawa, and I'm so excited to introduce you all to today's exciting panel, which covers so many fields of the space industry, including engineering, entrepreneurship, law, software, and research and development. Throughout the panel, we will be collecting audience questions in the chat of the YouTube live stream. So if you have any questions for our amazing panelists, please be sure to drop them in the chat, and hopefully our panel will get a chance to answer them. So now let's go ahead and meet our panelists for today. We are joined by Jacqueline Good, who is the founder and CEO of Magnestar Inc. We have Carolyn McGregor, AM and PhD, who is the Interim Dean of the Faculty of Business and IT at Ontario Tech University here in Oshawa. We have Sean Mitra, who is a space lawyer and the CEO and co-founder of Foundation Space Resources. And then also Francis Picotte, who is a spacecraft component sales engineer at Sinclair Interplanetary by Rocket Lab. So first of all, before we get into the questions, I just would like to ask each of panelists to give a brief introduction on who you are and what you're currently doing in the space industry. So we can start maybe with Jacqueline and then continue going like from left to right.
Sounds great. Thank you, Emily. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Absolutely. Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Good. I'm the founder and CEO of Magnestar, joining you from Northern Ontario today. Hope everyone's having a lovely Thanksgiving weekend, and thank you so much for having us, Emily. This is a great initiative and happy to be here. Here at Magnestar, we formed the company in December 2021. We are ensuring the resiliency of all space communications. We do so by mapping and monitoring and predicting when interference will occur, as well as assisting satellite operators in coordinating spectrum and how satellite operators protect their spectrum rights over the long term and obtain spectrum. With that, we see this as a critical issue within the space sector, as especially we go from 8,000 objects in space or active satellites in space to over 100,000 satellites in space. And the noise level between Earth and space is really what we tackle, and navigating potential collision or signal collision avoidances between Earth and space. And as I mentioned, I founded the company. Thrilled to be here today and answer any questions as it comes to entrepreneurship or space communications and everything in between. Thank you.
Awesome. And I think we can move on to Professor Carolyn.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. As Emily already mentioned, I'm currently the Interim Dean of our Faculty of Business and IT at Ontario Tech, but I actually run a joint research centre in AI for health and wellness between Ontario Tech and the University of Technology in Sydney. My focus area is on creating new computing platforms for humans in extreme settings. So whether that extreme setting is a newborn infant who is born very premature, whether it's a firefighter, an astronaut, or even a tactical officer. So I create platforms to be able to monitor them in real time and also to look at clinical studies of what happens to them in those extreme settings. So I'm very fortunate that I have a study running currently on the International Space Station. It's called Space Health. I'm using the Canadian Commissioned Biomonitor garment to gather data from the astronauts at certain times pre-flight, in-flight, and then post-flight. And actually also considering gathering, or I am gathering data on biological males and biological females to really start to gather that corpus of knowledge on biological females. There's some really interesting things that happen to humans in space. And I've been very fortunate to be able to extend my research from monitoring people on Earth to monitoring people in space. So back to you, Emily.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I think we can move on to Sean now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sean Mitra. So I'm co-founder and CEO of Foundation Space Resources, until very recently, a lunar water supply company. We're based in Calgary, though I personally actually just moved to Vancouver. But generally, the thesis of the company, though, was after doing a survey of existing initiatives on ISRU, and specifically at the time, mining water as sort of a keystone resources for human operations on the moon, and especially permanent human presence on the moon, we realized there was really not much of a resource science perspective approaching the problem. That's definitely increased over time, but still our sort of core thesis was, well, hey, we're in Western Canada. There's, well, 3 of us at the time with resource experience of varying degrees, plus contacts in the resource sector in Calgary. Why not try and bring that to space? We already had connections with some folks that we knew, and so it was a kind of COVID crazy dream, jumped into it, and now we've been at it for 3 years, and are currently getting close to developing MVP digital twin of the lunar environment. The idea being to be able to virtually test everything and also hopefully use that environment once we get some good numbers that are validated by real world and physical testing results on Earth to then start figuring out what actual things should we be designing and be able to go to space agencies and say, this is the reason why we think this design is necessary, rather than just saying, we've got a really cool refinery going, a really cool drill ready to go. Looking forward to this. Thanks, Emily.
Great. Thank you. And I think last of all, we have Francis.
Hello, everybody. My name is Francis Picotte. I am a spacecraft component sales engineer at Sinclair Interplanetary by Rocket Lab in Toronto. Obviously, as you can hear, I am not from Ontario initially. I am from Quebec. My first language is French. Hopefully, there's not too much of an issue with that. And that sort of places me into this weird mixed background that I have done a lot of things in my life. My first background was in business development, and eventually I went back to university because I found my passion for space, which may be very different than a lot of you, but may inspire others to do the same. So if you have any questions with that, let me know. And professionally nowadays, what I do as a sales engineer, I assist customers in determining the optimal solution for their spacecraft with respect to star trackers and reaction wheels, which are devices that help determine where a spacecraft is pointing in space. And if it's not pointing in the right direction, then help it go towards the appropriate orientation. And we are now, Sinclair Interplanetary, we're now part of the wider Rocket Lab family. So obviously Rocket Lab does a lot of spacecraft components like solar panels, separation systems, radios, etc., and obviously rockets. So super exciting, and I'm happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. So it was super interesting to hear all of your introductions, and you can definitely see that everyone in this panel has very different backgrounds and experiences. So I wanted to ask, how did you find your place in the space industry, and how did you know you wanted to work in space? This time, maybe we can start from Professor Carolyn.
Well, I was very fortunate for my work to be extended into space. It started really with an introduction from retired astronaut Dave Williams. I was working on a research project with the preterm infants, and we were deploying it in the hospital that he was actually the chief executive officer of, and we were launching a major event. But even before that, I had met him at an innovation conference, and that was running in his facility. And he was presenting about the opportunities in space for research and for monitoring human physiology. And then I came up and I presented on my work in monitoring human physiology and the fact that it could run autonomously. And he said, we need to talk, and I need to introduce you to the Canadian Space Agency, who then introduced me to NASA and the Russian Institute for Biomedical Problems. And then before I knew it, I was standing on a simulated Mars environment in Russia, in Moscow, learning a lot about their work, having a lot of their work translated to English, and it really went from there. So I think my key message and takeaway is that there are so many opportunities for you to build your skill set in an area that's terrestrial, and then to start to consider how that could work in space and could be applied. And now I work with SpaceX and Axiom and NASA and and European Space Agency as well. So it's just been an amazing opportunity that's just unfolded from that initial introduction.
That's really interesting. Then we'll ask this next to Sean.
Sure. Francis, I won't steal too much of your thunder, because you mentioned before we started how many more opportunities there are now, and I think that kind of goes in line with what I feel as well, and what Carolyn just said, is that, so I'm a lawyer by trade. Didn't do space work until I started my own space company after being a COVID layoff. But before then, I had been like a space nerd and passionate about space. And before going to university and high school, I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to apply to the three options at U of A, at the University of Alberta. I did bioscience in case I wanted to go to med school, applied for history and poli-sci if I wanted to go to law school, and I applied for engineering because I was like, if I do engineering, I want to be an aerospace engineer and build rockets. And so of those, I managed to land two, I think, long term. I mean, not rockets so much, but we hopefully riding some stuff on one day. But it was really, for me, a sort of fortuitous thing where in law school, I had sort of looked at actually an Economist article about space mining, and it was, I don't know, maybe 500 words, really brief, but it talked about how, this is a completely undeveloped area of law. There's huge potential for human society, given the amount of arguably nigh on infinite resources, though I have a lot of qualms with those claims that people will say. I'll get into that later. But sort of is to say that long term, yes, there's a lot of potential for humanity if we can mine off Earth rather than on Earth. But to do that, we need to settle the law for it. And it's one of the few areas of law where nothing has been really settled. Not nothing. Very little has been really settled yet. And that really appealed to me because it's very, very rare to find a wholly new area of law that you can work in. And so that was the legal plus space nerd angle that drew me to it. And so I was a COVID layoff in 2020, and so I had some time to think about, okay, what I want to do next. And so I decided I wanted to pursue the space angle, and I actually applied to the McGill, which has the Faculty of Air and Space. Faculty of Law has a Air and Space Law department, and they have a Master's of Space Law. So I got accepted, but before I actually had to decide whether or not I was going to go, I met my co-founders while attending a lot of virtual COVID conferences. And they talked about, what they want to do. And we started to get talking about the opportunity for Western Canada to really build a space industry and hopefully pivot some of that research expertise to an exciting growth potential industry rather than being just an oil and gas province for forever. And that was sort of my brainchild of like, oh, that'd be so cool to like give people an opportunity to do something new. That isn't just the old stereotype of let's just teach them all to code, because I think there's a lot of different ways to use your skills. So yeah, that's how I sort of got into it. And I think the bigger picture thing to say is sort of echoing Carolyn's comments that everyone in space I met is so nice. And I think if you are curious and want to learn about what people are doing, send them an email, send them a message on LinkedIn. Yeah, some people might not respond if they're too busy or didn't see your message, but I think the vast majority would be happy to give you some time to tell you about what's going on, how you could get involved, or even just at the very least, like what cool thing they're working on. Because almost everyone working in space is really working on something cool and they're really excited about it.
Oh, that's a great answer. I think it's really great that we have someone in the law aspect of space, because especially with this NASA Space Apps Challenge, the challenges cover such a diverse array of subjects, and so it doesn't only have to be the rocket scientists. So thanks for that answer, and I'd like to ask Francis now.
All right. For me, finding my place in the space industry was probably convoluted. I think ultimately it starts when I was a kid. I've always been passionate about space, but I very distinctly remember a conversation with one of my friends back then when I was seven years old, and his dream was to be an astronaut. And I thought about it, and I'm like, well, I was just that age where I was old enough to know that to become an astronaut, you needed to be the best of the best of the best of the best of the best. And I knew it was not me. But I was not old enough to realize that there were other things in the space industry. So I just went on and wanted to do various things, like be a programmer, develop computer games, whatever. And I eventually settled on business development. But eventually, fast forward when I was in my early 20s, I was working in business development. I loved what I was doing, strategizing for market development and marketing and operations within the company, how to organize subsidiaries to maximize our various opportunities. I loved what I was doing, but I didn't feel like I had a greater purpose. And that greater purpose came in when I started having health issues. So I had to have one of my kidneys removed. And when I was in the hospital, and the time afterwards for recuperating from it, I was reading a lot of things about space, and that's when I really renewed my passion for it, and I realized this is what I should have been doing all this time. This is my greater purpose. And over the next couple of years that followed that, I looked at various ways on how I could get involved in the space industry. Should I just use my background in business development? I don't have a lot of experience. I don't know anything about the space industry, which means it would be hard to found my own company as well. So what are the other options? Go back to university, study science, engineering. Oh, this is something that I'm very, very interested in too, designing hardware for space and components and sensors and cameras. And I really found my way through this thought process. And I was, again, I was in my 20s at that point. And so going back to university is not a small feat when you're already somewhere in life. I'll talk about that later. But that's really how I found my place in the space industry, from this background and approaching this career change with this already professional mindset that I had. So I'll come back to that later in the following question.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'd like to now ask Jacqueline this question.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Yes, I think that how I found my place in the space sector, I think that from my perspective, I always knew coming out of university that at some point I'd want to build a company. I was reading a lot of Malcolm Gladwell in university and learning about some of the skills that particularly position someone to be an entrepreneur in a good way. And I possessed some of those skills. And so from my perspective, once I graduated, it was all about developing the skills so that I could build a company at some point in my life. And when I was going through my background, it's all in data infrastructure, data science, data engineering, and working with a variety of different companies across North America on their data infrastructure and how to connect very complex systems together to decipher specific business outcomes. And I recognized that I had really built up this skill set, this network, as well as the resources that I was ready to build a company from the ground up. I knew that I wanted to be in space. And so I ended up connecting with everybody I knew who already worked in the space sector at that point. And I asked them how I could go from deep data tech to space technology. And they had all mentioned to me to go to the International Space University. And so I applied. I received funding from the European Space Agency. I studied and specialized in space engineering when I was at the International Space University. And then I came out and was brought into a program called Entrepreneur First in order to actually build the company. And to Sean's point, when I was going through that, I connected with as many people as possible in the program. I ended up connecting with 25 satellite operators in 6 months. And I asked them and tried to decipher specifically how I could leverage the skill set that I had built over the past sort of decade of working and apply that into the space sector to solve one of the largest problems in the space sector today. And the biggest thing that we heard from those operators and from regulators and people who had been in the space sector for 20 plus years was that the overarching concerns about signal interference, spectrum, coordinations of how satellite operators are working together to coordinate in space, and monitoring post-coordination to ensure clear pathways of communication between Earth and space was becoming an increasingly large issue. And that using my data background, we could solve that problem for the sector. And so for us, in terms of finding my place in space, it was really about when I knew I wanted to get into the sector, talking to as many folks as possible about how to do so, attending all the space conferences that I could online at the time, and really just deciphering where I could apply my skill set to benefit the sector in its entirety, and then going ahead and building.
Thank you for that answer. So I see we have an audience question asking about the experience pursuing a second career in the space industry. And I know in the last question, a couple of you mentioned space was not actually the first kind of industry you went into. So I was wondering if anyone would be interested in answering this question.
Well,
See,
if no
I
one
feel like it's
else,
targeted at you, but I can chat to you. But you first.
At the same time, Emily, I think we might want to move to the next question, because that's sort of what I was going to answer, which is a challenge we faced in our career and how we overcame it. And in my case, that was specifically my career transition. And I had a few years of experience in business development. I liked what I was doing, and this mindset of always thinking, where am I? What's out there? What are the opportunities and what are the risks? And in this mindset is how I approached my career transition. I knew I wanted to work on space hardware, such as sensors and actuators, and possibly on capabilities such as on-orbit deorbiting. And so I looked at all the skills that I needed and what was out there in terms of undergraduate degrees, because I did not have a background in science. I had all of strong math and science, etc. in high school. But in Quebec, high school is even earlier than your last year of high school. So I needed to go back to college, which is for us right in between university and high school. So I needed to go back to college first, do my prerequisites, and then go to university. And I also approached the university choice with the same mindset. Where do I need to go to maximize my chances in the industry? First off, I knew it was not going to happen in French, or at least not exclusively in French. So I needed to be able to do all of this work speaking English, which the first time I had my real conversation in English, I was 25. And from there, I need to know all of the technical know-how, knowledge, and theory in English as well, so I can converse and operate in my career in English as well. So I thought, well, let's go outside of Quebec. There's Concordia, and there are options, obviously, but I wanted to go outside to get this sort of internationality in the mix as well. But in the United States, too expensive. I looked at Europe, and eventually I settled, well, why not go to Toronto, where the tuition fees are not too high, because when you go back to university later in life, that's also part of the equation, a big part of the equation, actually. How you're going to finance that, coming back to approaching it as a business plan, right? So I already laid out my whole plan. It was almost a decade-long plan, so that I could eventually work on what I wanted to do in the space industry. And right after my undergrad, I decided to remain for a master's, because you don't necessarily need a master's degree to work in the space industry, but most people have it at the very minimum, because it's a very, very, very highly skilled domain or profession, at least when you're doing a technical work, right? And so I remained for a master's. That's where I really went further into sensors, cameras, and leading me to the star trackers, which Sinclair Interplanetary are working on in Toronto. And I think that's a good overview of the whole process. The last part I want to bring up is the networking that I wanted to do from the very, very onset of this plan. So my first semester I was in university, I was networking at least on a monthly basis. Yes, it's hard work. Yes, you need to develop soft skills and sometimes make cold calls, but get yourself involved in the industry very, very early on. Industry associations, conferences, like we mentioned before, reaching out to people on LinkedIn. Make sure you get involved in the industry as early as possible. And I think that's a good overview.
Thank you for that answer. So you did bring up the next question we had in the list of questions, which was, what is a particular challenge that you faced in your career that really sticks with you, and how did you overcome it? And I was also wondering, what is a good way to approach challenges, or what is the way that you maybe like to approach challenges? And this time, we can start with Sean.
Okay. Also, I see that there was a question about the like space law, but that's kind of off topic. So maybe I'll come back to it in the what's like working the space industry question. So for me, I think actually, unlike Jacqueline, I never really saw myself initially as being a business founder myself. I part of the reason I went to law school is because I was one of those people who graduated by undergrad and was like, okay, well, what am I going to do next? I thought I'd maybe want to do law school. I initially went to law school thinking I wanted to do international law, which space law is a subset of, but still really thought that I would more be looking to join a big organization, maybe government, maybe a nonprofit, maybe if I was lucky enough an early in-house counsel for SpaceX or something, but never really thought of myself as starting my own company. And so I think one of the big challenges for me was becoming more open to risk and to understanding the challenge of the unknown, because I think especially as somebody who relied on school to provide structure to my life, and then you as a law student graduating, you go to a big firm or you go to hopefully a place that's teaching you in your articles, which is your 1-year internship before you're a full lawyer, that gives you structure. And so once you're doing your own company, there's no more structure, right? It's all just on you and your founding team if you're lucky enough to have co-founders. And there's a lot of unknowns. And especially as me working on a space resources company with a lawyer, legal background, and I actually pointedly avoided, unlike my two co-founders, the resource side of things. I have a lot of background in technology law, so both healthcare, privacy, licensing, a little bit of patents, a little bit of trademarks, a lot of copyright, all of that sort of stuff. So, I mean, I think that very applicable to what we're doing. But in terms of the geoscience, there was a lot of time I spent in conferences and stuff, sitting there quietly like, yeah, I'm the lawyer. Don't have a lot to say, but I'm just going to listen and ask questions. I apologize if this is a silly question or I missed something. And everyone was really nice, but I think it was just learning to get comfortable with that lack of knowledge, especially coming from a career where you're expected to be a subject matter expert, right? Like as a lawyer, you're expected to be the voice in the room that can calmly answer and say, this is what the thing is, or it's, I don't know, but this is where I'm going to go to find it out. Versus with geoscience, I was like, well, I got Wikipedia, Google, and all of you, so I'm going to ask a lot of questions. But like, I think it really stuck with me because it was easier than I thought, which isn't to say it was easy, but it was horrifying to me when I started, of like sitting in some of these early conference virtual rooms during COVID and being like, okay, I'm going to turn my camera off because I really don't want someone to call me out and be like, why are you here? Who let the lawyer into this room? And that never happened, right? Like people, like I said, the space industry by and large is very welcoming. And I think that how I overcame it was essentially just diving in, asking questions, and people were really open with the fact that I was very upfront about my ignorance. And, over time, I think I've built a pretty good working knowledge. And I'm certainly not a space geologist or a planetary scientist, but I think I can at least have a conversant conversation now fairly confidently and be able to pick up what's going on in these areas. And at least for me, that's a very satisfying challenge to overcome, given that I didn't really take any courses for it. I just did it by doing. In terms of a good way to approach challenges as a student, one of the ways that I wish that I'd been more comfortable with as a student and continue to be more comfortable with is to fail early, fail often, and just keep trying. Because I am very much a perfectionist, but I find that I learn much faster if I just, submit, do it, figure out what was wrong, and then try again, and then try again. Same thing for asking questions rather than trying to wait until I understand exactly what's going on in the messaging. Just put a hand up. Obviously, don't interrupt and be polite, but just putting a hand up and asking when you don't understand a really foundational thing probably won't be that disruptive, assuming you're not making them explain the whole science to you. If there's just like one point you're missing, like very early on, I didn't know regolith was just lunar rock. That's a great one. Regolith is lunar rock, lunar dirt. And so for the first 3 sessions I was in, I was like, okay, I got to Google regolith. What is going on here? What's the composition of it? And it's like, oh, it's just a generalist term. So I think just being comfortable with failure and not knowing things, I think, is a really good way to approach things, that being in a formal school is not necessarily the best way to get comfortable with it, unless you're in specific programs. And most of the time when you're going through school, you get the information, you regurgitate it. You don't really get that feeling of, I don't know, what am I going to do? I guess I'll answer.
Thank you. So I know, Francis, you just gave a really good answer about challenges in the industry. So just in the interest of getting through as many questions as possible, I think we'll just move on to Jacqueline.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. I would say that, and one of the things I have as an objective over the next 30 minutes is just to give everyone on the line tangible tips and tangible things to do to increase their success coming out of university or whatever stage of their career they're in. In terms of overcoming challenges, one of the bigger challenges that I remember going through when I was in university was trying to figure out what I was going to do and what I was going to do next. And when you hit those career moments, you're like, oh, I thought I was going to go in this direction. I don't really think that's it. I had to go in a different direction, and trialing as many of those as possible. So one instance, when I was in second year university in undergrad, I thought that I originally wanted to be a psychologist, and that's what I was going to school for, was actually to be a psychologist. And so in second year, I was like, okay, if I'm going to dedicate time and resources towards this, I need to make sure that I like it. And so in second year, I Googled all the best psychologists in London, Ontario, because I was at Western, and I found one that would allow me to come shadow him 20 hours a week. And so I ended up going to his office almost every day, and we'd conduct sessions together, we'd create treatment plans together. So I got a real hands-on experience of what the work would actually have been like had I pursued that career path. And in deciding I liked that, I decided to actually pursue it in third year and join a research lab. So in 2 years, for third and fourth year university, I worked in a research lab because I knew that in order to become a psychologist, I would have to do a full master's and PhD, which is heavy amounts of research. And what I realized when I was in that research lab was that I didn't really like doing the research, and I didn't want to commit the next 7 to 8 years of my life of doing clinical research. And you have to find those things out as soon as possible, though, so that you can iterate and put the trajectory of your career path on in an appropriate way. And so one of those things I always did was find the opportunities, whatever they might be, to get as much real world experience as possible. Reach out to folks, ask to mentor, or ask to be a mentee to somebody who's already in the sector. We've talked a lot on this panel about reaching out to people who are already in the career or in their career paths. One thing that I use whenever I'm reaching out to somebody new is a very simple formula. That formula is why you, why me, why now? Why do I want to talk to you? What is it about you that attracted me to your profile or to want a conversation? Why me? What is the situation that I'm currently in my career that I think that you might be able to help me with because of the situation that you're in within your career? And why now? Why is this occurring right now? Why do we need to talk over the next few weeks? And when you use that type of formula, you're much more likely to get a positive response. And so that's what I've done within my career. It's all about getting real world experience, finding people who can drive you as mentors, and then also just building as many foundational skills as possible. I think that what this panel has demonstrated is that life takes you in different careers and different paths on a regular basis, and having as many foundational skills that you can apply to different things is really great. And even as you're going out to get internships or get those first jobs, it's a competitive process. At Magnestar, we've had well over 1,000 people apply to our company within the first year and a half. And the biggest thing that we look for is people who really stand out and jump off the page. And the ways to do that is one of the feedback I got when I was going after a really big job in my career was that take all of the job responsibilities that are listed in the application in terms of the things you'll be doing on a regular basis, put them in a chart of sorts with you have the actual description of the job, reference where you've done it previously and the outcome of that. And if there's any of those skills or those job responsibilities you have not done before, reference what they are and how you're going to overcome those gaps and learn from them and apply that. I find that when you go the extra mile, whether it be writing a cover letter, or Emily, I know that when you had interned for us, you created a video, and it was that video that was really stand out amongst your peers and made you a great candidate because it demonstrated your creativity and your capacity to go beyond the basics of just submitting a job application. And so those are the 3 things I would say to overcome career challenges is, again, really get the real world hands-on experience to decipher if this is the right career path for you. Reach out to folks using a formula that is effective and go above and beyond within your applications to stand out. and build your foundational elements early on. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much for that answer. I really like how everyone on this panel is emphasizing the proactiveness of reaching out to people and finding your own experiences. And now I'd just like to ask this career challenges question to Professor McGregor. Oh, I think he might still be muted.
Yep, there we go. In my case, it's a little different because space wasn't this different area to consider per se. It was more that it was the ultimate edge and it was another context area. So in my own personal case, I've learned about humans in all different extremes. And so for me, learning about humans in space was another layer in learning about how the body copes in different areas, because humans in space actually has a lot of parallels to humans when you are a diver, for example, if you're a career diver. So, but that has led to an opportunity where we've created some new programs though for students. So I have a Master of Health Science in Health Informatics, and some of my students through that program have gone on to work with the Canadian Space Agency. And we have our own conversion of the research in my team to be commercialized. I've started up 2 different companies in my career. So I think you have to really understand the best way to equip yourself with the knowledge and make those connections. And for the area of space medicine, there are some really wonderful opportunities in different ways, depending on whether you're a clinician or you want to pursue that clinical area first and then consider space medicine, or if you're more interested in the technologies that are used to support health in space. And then there are the great opportunities to get your foundational skills and then extend that to an understanding of what you need in space as well.
It's really great. So the next question we have is, what are you most excited for in the future of the space industry? And you can talk about just anything in the space industry that you think is exciting for the future. So this time I'd like to start with Francis.
All right. Something that I'm personally very, very interested in is obviously technology as an engineer. To me, all this technology that's getting smaller, faster, sensors that are getting more sensitive, more processing power that we can bring to these are all enabling also new capabilities. Such as adaptive optics, a very, very interesting field, very long baseline interferometry, which also allowed us, for example, to directly image a black hole, a distant black hole. How cool is that? But also directly image exoplanets. So the JWST has been able to measure the thickness of the atmosphere in certain wavelengths. Which allows us to know what this atmosphere is composed of on exoplanets that are light years away. How cool is that? So I'm very interested by the technology, but also I'm excited about really the activity that it will enable us to do in the next, probably in our lifetime. Which can be summarized as Bob Richards, the founder of CEDS USA and CEDS Canada, has put it out, expanding the economic sphere of influence of Earth. So currently, we are doing that slowly with, for example, the space industry right now is booming when it comes to LEO, and even further out, private missions to the moon and other planets further out in the solar system. It's really amazing. But very soon, we're going to be able to send a lot more people. We're already seeing private astronauts going to space. So in 30, 40, 50 years, are we going to be able to take a week-long vacation in space? So all of this can be summarized as expanding the economic sphere of influence of Earth beyond to LEO and cislunar space. And that's really exciting for me.
Yeah. That is definitely really exciting for sure. And I know I'd like to ask Jacqueline about what you're excited in the future of the space industry.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that got me the most excited about coming into the space sector was recognizing, to Francis's point, that we had put over, at this point, we'd put over 600 people into space. This is when I first started looking into it about 2.5 years ago. We put over 600 people into space, and you no longer needed to be an astronaut to go to space. And so the floodgates were opening. And I think that from the Magnestar perspective, as we see many more people going into space, we want to make sure that every human that goes into space is safe and has clear pathways of communication between Earth and space. I think here at Magnestar, we have very long-term goals of the work that we're going to be doing in deep space, and we're excited to pursue those goals. From an excitement standpoint as well, I think that there's so much work that needs to be done, both within the space sector and for the knowledge of everybody listening in. 70% of the space sector is in satellites. So there's about 300 active satellite operators and about 1,500 new companies building space systems and satellites. And it's huge. It's massively growing. It's extremely exciting. There was one question in the chat about entrepreneurship in space industry, and all those companies that are building space systems are built by people. Like, these are entrepreneurs who decided to go forward and build teams to build objects for the space sector. And many of those objects have positive implications for us here on Earth, whether that comes to observing from a climate change mitigation standpoint, or telecommunications and connecting people who have never been connected before, or increasing our own connectivity in Northern Canada. One of the things that we look at, we're a part of the Optical Consortium of Canada, and if you look at a map of Canada, like beyond the 20% line, 80% of the country is reliant on satellite systems. When we were first building Magnestar, we recognized that there was this article that came out from Iqaluit where they had a satellite outage, and they were unable to get gas, they were unable to get groceries, they were unable to pay employees, they were unable to get money out of ATMs, they were unable to do anything. It really shuts down the entire ecosystem. And so increasing the resiliency of space services is something that I'm really excited about. And especially, as I mentioned, we have more people in space, gearing up for that future. I think that often when I go and speak at universities and I ask folks, how many people watching want to go to space in the audience today, I'm getting like 70% of people, like business students, saying that they want to go to space. So just the amount of people that I think want to experience life beyond Earth and make sure that everything we're doing is continuously benefiting Earth. But I think that demand is always going to be increasing, especially as we deal with things that are happening here on Earth, and making sure that everything we're doing in space is coming back and benefiting our own planet. But preparing for that future is extremely exciting. And for everyone in the audience or online watching this, I would always just say that making sure that you're building up the foundational skills so that when the opportunities come about, you're ready and you're prepared for them. And doing things like this, lots of extracurriculars and everything else to make yourself stand out is always a part of that. But that future is coming. Like, Amazon is preparing to put millions of people in space. And that's within our lifetime. And as we look at the next generation coming up, I think that we will have to work through a number of the challenges. Even when I think about like the satellite graveyard, like the graveyard of satellites that's up there, that we will have to work through within our generation. And that's coming up, especially as we put more humans into space. And so thinking through what those issues are going to be and how we could solve towards them today to reduce their impact in the future, but also prepare for them from an opportunity standpoint on what that potentially can look like and how that would benefit humans and what humans create.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So I know, Carolyn, you are actually the research chair in artificial intelligence for health and wellness and the director of the Joint Research Center in AI for Health and Wellness. So I was wondering if, along with your answer for this question, if we could also maybe incorporate some of this audience question about the role of AI in the space sector.
Definitely. I'm really excited about the work that we're doing now and how we're positioning for the future. And I found it interesting that, and Jacqueline's right, at the moment, there's such a focus on the satellite sector, but the other areas are growing now. And to take more humans into space, we have to consider, spacecraft, the space habitats. We have to consider health in space. And all of that requires systems that can be doing a lot of work for whether it's the humans in space or their environment in space. And so I'm really excited about the infrastructures that we're looking to create. And certainly I'm very passionate about doing that with a conscience, considering sustainability and an appropriate use of environments so that we don't have those negative impacts that we've found with some of the technologies we've created on Earth. We've got that opportunity now to think about how we grow these new systems in space and do them with a much more focus on creating less impact in the environment. And so certainly in my work, so the systems that we're creating, what's coming is really changing the way that, or creating new ways for those what we call big data pipelines. So thinking about all of that sensor data that we need to ingest for environmental habitat information, for health in space information. It was really wonderful for me to be one of the principal investigators on a research study on that very first Axiom all private astronaut crew mission to the International Space Station. To be one of very few people who were monitoring physiology of those more ordinary people going into space. Also being part of just the logistics of a private organisation interfacing so heavily with NASA to be able to bring those private astronauts onto a facility that is run by NASA. You know, all of those logistics planning, as well as looking at the health, these were really important key pieces in this infrastructure. And for Axiom now to have won the bid to utilise the last connector port on the International Space Station so that they can build out their new station. That's a great advantage for Axiom to build that new station. And it also just demonstrates that we're moving into a different era where commercial is really going to be at the forefront of provisioning the experience in space, which gives us different opportunities for scale, different opportunities to bring different players into the market. So, and I haven't even spoken about mining, which I will leave to our next speaker really to speak about, but the mining sector, mining asteroids, mining on the moon, doing it in an appropriate way with environmental considerations. There's so much, and it's easier than a lot of people think to start working in space.
Great. Thank you so much. And now I guess we can move on to maybe more of the mining with Sean.
Sure. So I feel like a lot of what I had to say was covered, perhaps not too surprisingly, by my fellow panelists, which is to say we're in a really exciting area of space exploration. So I'm going to go maybe a bit hyperbolic and just go with like the gut feeling of what I'm excited about, which is we are honestly at a precipice of a new epoch of human civilization. Like if you think about it, the dream for our company and what space agencies are talking about are building a cislunar economy. And so what that means is it means between Earth and the moon, we want to build an economy that's permanently in operation. And so what this means is all sorts of things that were never contemplated before are now being realistically planned for. So that includes first permanent human presence on the moon. And so permanent human presence on the moon then lets you do things like our initial and our long-term goal of mining water on the moon. You can use water for life support and fuel. If you have that fuel, you then have now an economic basis for refueling on the moon, but also for servicing satellites, to Jacqueline's point of we need to reduce and hopefully slow down the growth of that graveyard of satellites. Servicing satellites will be part of that solution. And so because the moon's gravity well is so much smaller than Earth's, even though it's so hard to actually do the mining side, if you can get a reliable supply of water once that operation is established, there's a business case that it can be made that it will be more economically viable to do it on the moon and then transport it there than to go off of Earth. Longer term, you get even cooler things like to Carolyn's point about space mining and asteroids. Granted, I do have a lot of strong opinions in asteroid mining as a near-term goal. I think there's a lot of unresolved challenges that I feel like asteroid mining enthusiasts tend to gloss over. But assuming you can successfully mine them, there's as far as we can imagine, infinite amount of metals and precious metals especially you can access. In addition to that, once you have that supply of metals, you can then use on orbit or low gravity manufacturing to build all sorts of gigantic megastructures that aren't possible in Earth's gravity because you don't have to worry about them collapsing in on themselves while building. And so we're essentially on, anyways, I can talk about this forever, but once you let your imagination go, there's a lot of stuff being enabled right now that has really interesting and far-reaching things. And I'm super, super excited about that and excited to be able to say I'm working on something that I can say has a to B relation to some of the stuff getting established and growing.
It's a really great answer. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm hoping we can get through 2 or 3 more questions. So the next one I'd like to ask is, what is one thing you think is a fundamental experience for a high school or university student to have? And is there anything that you did or experienced along the way that you think really helped you on your career path? And then this time we can start with Jacqueline.
The first thing that came to mind, I'm gonna keep this nice and short and snippy for the next 2 to 3 questions. Feels like we're doing rapid fire now. The first thing that came to mind for what students ought to be experiencing in high school and as well as potentially in university is actually playing sports. I think that team sports are immensely important into development of self-esteem, confidence, how to work in a team, how to build towards a goal, what failure feels like, what success feels like. I would encourage folks actually to get on a team, whether that's rugby or badminton or cross country, whatever it might look like. I would say team sports is actually one of the biggest things that's helped me within my career.
Awesome.
I also grew up playing competitive hockey. So if anybody wants to get in on the hockey stuff, that's what helped me the most. But yes, team sports.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And now I'd like to ask Carolyn that same question.
Well, for me, I guess my suggestion would be to really understand what the latest trends are in certain areas and think about how you can become a specialist. Because one of the things that's really helped me is that I became a specialist at the forefront of what's now called big data. And so my focus area within AI and other aspects is streaming data, which is the aspect of big data that I work with. And so sensor data coming from all different types of sensors. So I've become quite a specialist in that area. And it means when I applied into space that I have had a lot of experience in deploying those types of systems in banking, retail, finance, and in the medical area, which really allows me to speak with some authority when I bring that expertise into the domain. So becoming a specialist, working in, that leads you down a consulting pathway. And I think that that is a really good skill set to develop.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. And now I'd like to ask Sean if there are any experiences you'd like to recommend.
Yeah. So I think we've already covered a lot of the things that would come to mind, which is try and get some, exposure to industry earlier on that's been set up on. So sort of building on Jacqueline's point, I think keeping some of your passions and hobbies outside of your focus on your school and subject matter alive, I think is really helpful and healthy. Both for the reasons that Jacqueline mentioned, in that, especially if it's interacting with other people, you build those team skills and social skills in a different way. Fun thing that I didn't mention, I don't think I've told anyone here before. I used to play competitive video games. Team Fortress 2 is my game. That was my law school personal statement that I wrote about, was why being a hardcore gamer made me a good candidate for law school. So I very vehemently believe that and still believe that. But my main point, though, is that, well, on one, I've built a lot of international relationships through video games, but more generally, I think having my various hobbies to fall back on has been really valuable in staying sane through the grind of real life. Because I think one of the other scary parts of graduating for me were that, like, there's no end of semester, there's no end of school, like there's no end goal. Like, you're working. Like, sure, you have goals that you set up, but often those things change, as we've heard, or you don't get that promotion, or you get laid off, and all of a sudden that's really terrifying. So having something constant in your life that keeps you level, I think, is really valuable and not really stressed very much while you're in school.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Now I'd like to ask Francis.
I will start by building on Sean's answer. When you start working in the industry, it has been your end goal for the past 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, your whole life possibly. But once you get 6 months to a year, you're realizing that there's no more end goal after that. You realize that this is what you're going to be doing for the next 40 years of your life until you retire and eventually die, right? So these 40 years are what's really important. Obviously, your studies, building relationships, lifelong relationships, that's all very important. But these 40 years, if you screw up, how are you going to pivot later on? I didn't screw up in the first place, but I pivoted to better orient myself towards what I wanted to do. And this, where it is going, is get to know what you're passionate about. And that is through various ways, such as Jacqueline mentioned before, finding and creating your own experiences so that you can iterate very early on and find out what you're really passionate about, what your skill set is most appropriate for, possibly even which country you want to work in later on, because that's a very internationalized industry. And all of that starts with networking. Networking is not, and I repeat, is not a way to find a job. In fact, if that's your mindset, that's arguably self-defeating, and I could go on privately on that if you want later on. Networking is to get to know the people, get to know what they're passionate about, getting exposed to what's out there. That's the very important one. So networking, including internships, very important, but also getting involved with industry associations, conferences, etc., where, year after year, you're starting to get to, you meet the same people, you get to know them, and then once the conversation gets passed towards the weather and what they're doing in life, you really start having meaningful conversation with these people and getting to know what's really out there, what it's really like working in these fields, and what sort of technologies, applications, etc., that you could focus on. Because if you screw up, say you go in the wrong field for your master's or your PhD, it's really hard to pivot back. So I would even argue go get experience before your master's or your PhD. It could be a much longer conversation, but all of that boils down to say, get to know your place in the industry, get to know what you're passionate about.
That's a really great answer. I see we do have a couple of audience questions, but just because we only have a few minutes left, and since some of those questions are maybe more specific towards like one or two panelists, I'd just like to maybe move on to our last question. And for the Space Apps Challenge participants, we will be sharing the LinkedIn of our panelists later on, so you can ask them specifically any questions you have later. So I'd like to move to our last question. What final piece of advice would you give to students who aspire to pursue a career in these space-related fields? And since that's a bit of a general question, if you want to be more specific, like are there any skills or experiences that are valuable in this industry? Or maybe even what can students do tonight, like now or even after this panel, that will be able to help them on their transition into the space industry? And this time I'd like to start with Carolyn.
Yeah, I want to build on my last comment where I said that I am quite interested in specializing. And there's this concept known as the ikigai, and really understanding where your interest area, your natural skill and ability, what the world needs, these things all intersect. So I'm really trying to create things for the betterment of society. So it's one of the things that I think that you really need to start to think about is, what are your natural areas of curiosity in? What are you naturally good at? What do you enjoy? There are so many different areas to be able to connect into space, and space can either be extension of what you're doing, or space can be that directed career choice. So it's really a balance and thinking about what it is that you're interested in, because certainly I say to people all the time that I really enjoy, like when I wake up in the morning, aside from obviously administration things that might not be as exciting, but what I do for a living, I genuinely enjoy. And people ask me, why are you in Canada when you're an Australian and you could be back there, with better weather, and the opportunities that are presented to Canadians. I get to run an experiment with astronauts. Canada has crew time available to have the astronauts participate in studies. Australians don't have that opportunity. We don't have, as an Australian, crew time available in the current mix of the International Space Station. So there are lots of things that you can do. Start thinking about the area you're interested in and start looking at information. And I'll be happy to help anyone who's interested.
Great, thank you so much. And now I'd like to ask Sean any last words of advice.
Okay, some of these have come up, but I'm just going to mention again. First and foremost, what could you do now? Look at existing student groups that you could get involved with. So Space Apps Challenge would be a great one right now. If you aren't looking at doing it next and you're on YouTube or something, maybe consider it. But then there's SED, SGAC. Most schools in Canada now have various rocketry clubs. Look at these opportunities out there and get involved, because there's a lot more out there. Zenith Pathways application I think is closing today, so you're probably not going to be able to make it this year, but even if you're graduating next year, you're still okay. So look at Zenith Canada Pathways. I think it's a great opportunity as one of the volunteers who worked on founding it. So I'm biased, but I hope that Jacqueline can speak to, and Emily as well, that it was a good experience to be a participant in. What else can I say? The other thing that I would mention is that keep an open mind about trying things. We've talked a lot about, trying different things, getting exposure to have more real world experience to understand what you like or don't. But with that, within reason, because you obviously have limited amounts of time, you can be surprised by what you like. And so for me, the example I would give is that when I went to law school, I thought I didn't want to do business law. I didn't want to be a commercial contracts lawyer. I thought that was just like pencil pushing. So I avoided all the commercial contracts. I did international trade, I did administrative law, criminal law, pretty much everything I could, even tax law. And I was like, I don't want to do business contracts. And then I got to practice. And I was like, oh, I actually like contracts. And so now really the core of my practice on my day-to-day is commercial contracts. And I learned it all on the job. And it was probably a bit more painful than if I had just taken more of it in school than the core requirements. But I think it's a good example of you can be surprised by what aspects in life you like. And there are things that you may not know about it that you will never understand is something that appeals to you until you get some closer exposure. For me, the business side of things is I like to understand the why behind things. And so often when you do business law, if you understand the why for why this contract is happening for a core business, that makes that contract way easier to negotiate, draft, sign, everything. And that was an aspect that I just didn't even click. But I was like, oh, you actually get to the core of that much faster and to a solution much faster than, say, litigation, which I did for a while, where there's a lot of angry negotiation for quite some time before you settle.
Great. Thanks for that answer. And just to maybe elaborate a bit more on student opportunities for space right now, I know you mentioned the Zenith Fellowship, which is the program I was able to do last summer and is how I was able to intern with Jacqueline's company, Magnestar, last summer, which is a really great experience. That I believe the application is still open until
it's actually
next
a week.
week.
Sorry,
Yes, on the 13th.
So you do have time, but it is an intense application. So if you're interested, start now.
I would definitely recommend applying. In a week, I think it would be possible. And also for anyone here because this is an Oshawa event, from Ontario Tech University, I believe the applications for the space and rocketry team are still open right now. So that would be a good thing to go for. And now I'd just like to move on to Francis for pieces of final advice.
Thanks, Sean, for posting the link. I was going to ask someone to do it. Just a note about Zenith, from the perspective of an employer of Zenith interns, it's amazing. We get really highly qualified students, super passionate, and yeah, just go ahead and apply. It's an amazing program. So I don't really have another piece of advice further than what I've already given. This is more inspirational, I would say. Right now is the best time to join the space industry. Business is growing. We're talking eSpace, for example, just filed a couple of months ago an application for over 100,000 satellites. We can discuss the sustainability of that, but it just illustrates how business is booming across the board, old space and new space alike. It's just growing so much. But if you look at the demographics, there will be so many people. I don't know the percentage. It's probably 20, 30% of our current workforce that's going to retire the next 10 to 15 years. And that has already started. So for young people starting their career and wanting to work in the space sector, but in general anywhere else, but especially with the growth in the space sector, this is the best moment of your life. The opportunities for taking leadership, for demonstrating initiative, and for rapid advancement in a company have, to my opinion, never been better since the Apollo era in the 1960s. So this is the best moment. Make sure you make the best of it. Go for it. Find what you're passionate about and just go for it. Don't take any shortcuts. Just do it. There's no excuse not to.
Yes, that's really awesome. And now, last but not least, I'd like to ask Jacqueline for any words of advice.
Absolutely. The biggest thing I would say is that this is your life, and to create the life that you want to live in, and to create the world that you want to live in, and create a space that you want to live in. If you want to live in a world where people are going to space on a regular basis, then build the technology that enables people to go to space on a regular basis. If you want to live in a world that has clean water and clean air, then focus on building the facilities to have clean water and clean air. Like, this is your world. So whatever impact you want to have, be ambitious, go after it, seek those goals, accomplish those goals, and focus on what the world is like. What's your ideal world? What world do you want to live in, and how can you create that future?
Great. Thank you so much for that answer. So I know we're a little bit over time, so thank you so much for our audience getting involved and asking such wonderful questions. And of course, thank you to our incredible panelists today for your amazing advice. I know I, for one, am very inspired and will take away so many things from this panel. It was such a pleasure having you join us today. And thank you so much. I will end the stream now, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Great.